we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Welcome to another episode of the Energy Impact Podcast. Our guest today is Tim Dunn, the founder and chief investment officer at Terra Alpha Investments. Tim, great to have you on.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Before we find out about the portfolio you're building at Terra Alpha, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from?
Sure. Well, I'm currently sitting here in Washington, D.C., literally about 12 blocks from where I was born, at Georgetown University Hospital. There's a lot of journey in between then and now, but I was born in 1961. It was right in the heart of beginning of a really pretty tragic decade of civil strife, assassinations, and I grew up very much in the Cold War era.
Here in D.C.?
Here in D.C., the Maryland suburbs of D.C.
Crazy. And did you have some context of this conflict? Like, you were pretty young.
I was pretty young, but my family was very engaged, informed, and the Washington Post would arrive every morning, and you'd look at it and see what was on the front page, and sometimes you ask questions. And then I distinctly remember in elementary school going through, nuclear attack drills where we'd hide under our wooden desks as like the protection against that from happening, from being in danger. Or sometimes we'd even go down in the basement of the building. So yeah, the idea of Cold War and nuclear weapons and the Soviets attacking us was very, very real.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So how did that, you bring it up now, did that influence what you studied or like what you wanted to grow up to be?
Absolutely. I ended up going to college at William & Mary in Virginia, and my intent was to go into the Foreign Service. And I took a lot of classes, and it was an international relations major. I took classes in nuclear treaties, and that's where I was going to go until I realized two things. One, actually, it took a long time to get from being a little new person in foreign service to where you're sitting across the table and negotiating on nuclear arms treaties. And two, I took a class in finance, in global trade and finance, my junior year, and all of a sudden became someone who was, I was growing up in DC. You don't really think about Wall Street and capital markets. And all of a sudden, things like the World Bank and the IMF and global banking became something I heard about, I understood that was this force that was sort of ignored largely in Washington. So that kind of shifted me from focusing on particularly international relations and foreign service into more of the capital markets. Interesting.
So it's just one class and you're like, hey, I want to do something different. I mean, it feels like there was more there.
No, I have to admit, I probably didn't have junior year in college is when you really start to realize, oh, I better actually start thinking about what I'm going to do after college. and plan A was not really looking likely I was going to go there. So all of a sudden I was like, well, this is something that seems really interesting. I grew up in a family of lawyers in Washington, D.C. with a lot of policy stuff. So it was just really, truly a new area for me. And this is now we're talking 1980s, early 1980s, which was the jobless recovery. And so I had really the credentials that would otherwise allow me to be a really potentially successful salesperson for Procter & Gamble or something like that.
Right. Right.
So I went right to business school right out. So that it really led me to go to business school, and then that led me to other things.
Got it. And really targeting finance, or you said, okay, there's this like broad world of business that I can explore for a couple years.
I think it was more finance, not so much working in a company, in a traditional company, but that really evolved was in business school because I went to Northeastern University, which I cheerfully refer to as the fifth best business school in Boston. Um, Still a pretty good business school, but it
Yeah.
was good company. But they used the case study methodology, and you just studied companies and what made a company successful. And that to me was really interesting. But I was more in the, okay, I want to do this from a observational perspective. So manage maybe in consulting, maybe investment banking, maybe investment management. So that was kind of the way I looked at it. Um, but it was a fascinating transition in my whole understanding of the world because, obviously most people don't grow up thinking about Harvard case studies and, things like that.
Interest rate hedging isn't normal dinner conversation.
Yeah. I was also probably not the most finance, numbers oriented person. I was more of the bigger picture strategic thing, but I
Got
still
it.
did okay in finance and at business school. So
Yeah, I bet. I bet. In the fifth best in the area.
at the fifth
But,
best.
and so, okay, so then, yeah, what did you, out of those things, what did you end up doing? Like, how did you transition into the working world?
So before I get there, let me do one little sidebar.
Oh,
So
perfect.
Northeastern has what's known as a co-op program, which means that every student at Northeastern, whether you're an undergrad or a grad student, has to do a work stint
Hmm.
during their time. And in the business school, that was literally they started a recorder system. So basically, you as a student would fill a full-time job at a company, and then for 6 months, and then you'd be replaced by another Northeastern student. And that was a really important experience for me, particularly someone who went right from undergrad to my MBA program. And what was kind of interesting, and it kind of has played back in other ways over my career, is my internship was at a company that was called the Yankee Atomic Electric Company, which is a nuclear engineering consulting firm. And I worked in the fuel cycle department. And the main job was modeling and trying to assess which historic contracts that they had signed for fuel cycle for fuel were the worst, so they could figure out which ones to try to get out of. And it had been a lesson learned because they'd signed all these contracts in the 70s tied to the price of oil.
Mm.
And then price of oil in the early 70s, and then price of oil went up, and it was a take or pay contracts.
For
So
nuclear fuel, they tied it to marginal price, and fascinating.
it was absolutely tied to the price of a barrel of oil.
Wow, that's crazy. I
These are
mean,
like
yes,
10-year, 20-year contracts.
well,
Take or
yeah,
pay.
you lock in cross commodity risk. You're asking for some. I guess it was before deregulation. Like there wasn't as much volatility then, right? I mean, is that
No, well, there was a lot of oil price volatility, but there was not. They were just passing along to.
yeah,
They
crazy?
were all regulated entities, but it was still kind of egregious. Anyway, so that was an experience in both working in a company that made me think, I probably want a place that's a little more creative, a little more room to accelerate your growth than working in a company. But it also was another experience around how deals are structured and companies are structured that can really influence, your outcomes.
Totally. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So,
you pretty much like said, okay, no company. So yeah, investment banking, consulting. I mean, that seems like the logical path.
yeah. And then there's this world of investment management, and I really didn't know much about any of them. So I interviewed in all those areas but increasingly became clear that the one that made the most sense to me, I mean, investment banking, obviously, it's a high value industry. It's important. But you just kind of go in and do deals and then you move on. And management consulting, you go in and you assess and you make recommendations, and then the company either does or doesn't do it, but you go on. And you don't really have that much influence, and you don't even really have a sense of satisfaction because you don't, they do it, they just totally can ignore you. In the investment management business, what I loved about it, and I still do, is you do your analysis, you take your best effort to understand the opportunities ahead of a company, and then you generally usually put money in, or sometimes you short a company and you find out whether you're right or not. So you really do directly benefit from your work, or your clients directly benefit from your work.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was appealing to me. I also kind of like the fact that there was no set of specific rules. You just kind of find the information you think is going to matter, and you take that information in, and you hopefully make better decisions than other people.
Yeah, the active management. We can certainly get into all the theory there. I guess that's a big universe. So where did you start? I mean, were you public equities? You started on the private side. How
I've
did that
always
go?
been in public equities, again, because I was really drawn to big companies that are operating in the same industries, and some are more successful. I remember distinctly, for instance, a case study that was about Southwest Airlines, and they were a pretty big new startup still then, and still operating mostly out of Love Field in Dallas, Texas, and they had this Callagher, the CEO, the founder, had this really basic idea that kind of revolutionized, was the element that made Southwest Airlines what it was. He said, "Hey, why don't we actually make it fun to work for the airline, and then make it fun for the passengers so that they'll come back." And this is a time just after deregulation, where most airlines were it's kind of, we're back to that now. It's like, it was a pretty unpleasant experience, and you just did there was very limited friendly service. So that was, to me, a really good example, and in a way, a very early sign of a company that understood stakeholders. If your employees are happy, your customers are happy. Now, obviously, Southwest has moved way past those days, and they more recently are known for not treating their customers very well, and I think they're paying the price for that. So anyway, that was a good example, which I was sort of like, well, these big companies are really interesting, and the markets are right there in front of you. You can really tell whether you're right or not. So I went into public equities. I worked for a bank in Providence, Rhode Island, that at the time was managing about $2 billion in assets, of client assets, and was covering a quarter of the S&P 500. So I was covering industries from electric utilities to consumer products and a bunch of things in media. It was kind of a fire hose of like taking on information and learning it. And that was a great couple-year experience. And then I worked for a bank in Philadelphia, PNC, for 2 years, only covering consumer companies, and about 15 companies, and really digging into understanding a company. And then ultimately ended up in LA with a firm called Capital Research, which manages the American funds, and at the time was about a $60 billion asset manager, and worked my way as an analyst and then as a portfolio manager there. And during the time I was at Capital, the firm grew from 60 billion to 1.2 trillion. And I ended up managing money in three of the firm's biggest funds, which were Growth Fund of America, Capital World Growth and Income Fund, and Euro Pacific Growth Fund.
Wow.
So it's pretty.
You had geographies and industries that you were. That's a wide mandate.
Yeah, well, obviously, as a portfolio manager, then you have a team of analysts. I mean, Capital has hundreds of analysts, and they're feeding you their ideas. And so it's a much different kind of role, but you're ultimately making a decision of what goes into the portfolio or not, and still subject to whether you're doing it well or not.
Yeah.
But it is a very different role, and for certainly at firms like active management firms like Capital, the analyst role versus the portfolio manager role. At other firms like hedge funds, so on, they could be pretty much the same thing, but it's a little different.
Yeah, I find it quite challenging, just as part of my career, to sort of manage, like to. I always felt like when you're doing the math and you're doing the analysis and you really understood the company, like you had more conviction in actually making the decision. And then when you are having to sift through secondhand all of these different analyses, it's quite challenging.
Yeah, no, there's a real pride in being able to really know that you know more about the company than almost anyone else if you've been doing it and you understand the industry. And then as a portfolio manager, you're in that curse of sort of being, a little more inch deep and mile wide kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, with real time feedback on performance and no, fascinating. Okay, well, so bring us then to today with Terra Alpha and how that came about. Is it still? I guess this wasn't totally clear to me. It's still public equities, or are you doing
Yeah,
some private work as well, or what's the How
just
did that come
public
about? What's
equity.
the scope? Tell us about the company.
Yeah, so let me get you kind of caught up to okay, what's happened since, because I left Capital in 2009.
Oh,
And the
okay, great.
reason I left Capital in 2009 was I was increasingly um, recognizing the role that my role and the capital markets role in some of the global sustainability challenges, right? I mean, that seems self-evident for many people. Certainly at the time, it was less self-evident. And obviously, I'm sort of the catalyzing event in my career was probably literally I was in Hong Kong at a conference, and Al Gore did a personal presentation, about 30 of us, on his Inconvenient Truth. And it was just sort of crystallized what was brooding in my head anyway around the role of corporates in contributing to some of these problems, and therefore the investors in those corporates had to take some responsibility. And I should side note, my wife of 39 years is a planetary geologist, so it's not like I didn't have a resource I could turn to and say, so what is going on about this whole climate
Yeah, you
thing?
had some inside baseball.
Yeah. So I left Capital and I really went and worked with nonprofits, environmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, like the Sierra Club, like Carbon Disclosure Project, which is the biggest repository of carbon information, corporate carbon information, and really spent a lot of time trying to help those nonprofits do a better job of interacting with investors and companies around the understanding the role they play in the environmental challenges and helping them have more information so they can actually do a better job or reduce their negative impacts. Because we have an economy, a society that's detrimental to our planet's natural resources, but we can and should and need to transition to be less detrimental. So we get back to sustainability, right? We all kind of understand that. Well, most of us understand that. And so that ultimately led me to, it was 5 years of really intellectual learning and thinking, and then ultimately came back to the conclusion that the biggest impact I could have is being back in this big force called the capital markets, but doing it in a way that really deeply integrated the impacts that a company in the portfolio that might be in a portfolio is having on those natural resources, key natural resources. So that kind of led to the creation of Terra Alpha. Originally as sort of a demonstration tool, now is more of just a living, breathing, active manager of public equities on behalf of our clients. So at its core, the reason Terra Alpha exists is to help enable a sustainable planet for society. Our way of doing that is through the capital markets, both as a direct investor and also as a leading by example, that how you can actually do the approach investing in a slightly modified way than it's been traditional, which is traditionally, as you know, has been ignoring what is belovedly by some called externalities, right? The impact on the environment and society, as though there is no such thing, or it's not the responsibility of public companies or any company, and changing that narrative and saying, in fact, that may have been true. You could have gotten away with that, but the reality is that the cost of that is going to keep getting higher. And so you're better to get ahead of it, manage it better, and be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And that just makes good business decision, right? I mean, if you're trying to grow a business long term, you are better off being aware of all the ways that your business impacts other companies, other markets, other resources, and how those might alter the costs for that company, whether it's direct costs or indirect costs. So being a smart company in the 21st century requires a more holistic look at those issues. And we think same is true for an investment management firm. A smart investment management firm, 21st century, considers those factors. Exactly what they do with those information is up to them, but that's the premise. So Terra Alpha, our philosophy is to allocate capital to companies that are profitably leading a transition to a truly sustainable economy. And we view us, profitable in that we want to find companies that have a path to actual real profits and cash flow, and truly sustainable meaning one that operates within the natural resource boundaries of our planet and serves the actual needs of society.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so a bunch of different questions, I guess, but I kind of want to go down this line because I think you hit two sides of the coin that I generally hear from folks with similar types of mandates. And I should give you kudos for being one of the earliest firms. I think, 2015, 2014, you were probably a little bit of a lone
We were a
duck in
little
a
ahead of
room.
the curve.
Yeah.
Give us some time to get ready.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, today I think you're in good company. So yeah, kudos to you for being ahead of that curve. But yeah, there's like the risk mitigant part, which you discussed, right? Is that, okay, well, if you don't consider externalities, you're ignoring large potential liabilities that may not be liabilities today. So I think that's one good, just sort of fundamental rationale. And the other side is always, well, we think they are positioned to outperform either based on future pricing of competitors' liabilities and or consumer behavior. So maybe, and I think you basically said both of those things, which makes complete sense. But talk to me a little bit about how you evaluate those. I mean, those are both quite subjective metrics, I think. How do you boil that down into the broader analysis of an underlying company?
Yeah, well, one at a time. I mean, it's really the short answer. I mean, there's a lot of fundamental research that goes into this, and there's a perception out that there's a lot of it's a very data intensive approach, and if you just have all the data, you can just get these simple answers, and that's a misperception out there often, that you can just create a quantitative strategy and address this. At its core, the reason that can't happen is most of what you really need to know is what's going to happen in the future.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Totally.
What is that company planning to do? As you said, what are their competitors going to do? What's going to happen? Where's the economy going? And the data, all the data in the world doesn't tell you anything about the future.
Yeah.
So what we try to do is a couple of things. One is we use our sort of broad thematic frameworks to identify companies we think might be of interest and do deep analysis around that company to determine if that's correct. And so the broader thematic is, at its core, there's some certain things that are just happening in the world, new technology, new capacity with semiconductors, new information sources, more proliferation of information and data mining and all the other things. That's just happening, right? Demographics are happening. And then there's things that are happening or likely to happen to allow us to become more sustainable. So things like the electrification of everything, at the same time decarbonizing, at the same time changing food systems so that they're no longer as negatively impacting soil and forests and land use. Those things are all things that must develop if we're going to actually manage to have a sustainable planet with 10 billion people on it, right? So we look at all those factors and say, okay, that's where the economy almost inevitably needs to go over the next, who knows exactly how long, 5, 10, 20 years. And does this company look like they will either benefit from those changes or they're actually leading those changes, each of which is interesting. So one being more of like a climate solutions or sustainability solutions company, and others just being enablers of that or beneficiaries. And we come back to what that means. So that's a look and say, this looks like a kind of company strategy and business area that would be interesting. So let's really figure out if that's just, it looks that way or if it actually is that way. And we have two different frameworks we use for considering the fundamentals of any company we're investing in. They both are looking pretty far ahead in the future. One is, and our kind of core differentiator is what we call environmental productivity. And that is really how a company uses and impacts key natural resources for the planet. And it really starts with a characterization of the company, like where does it have, is it a high carbon intensity company? Is it a high water use company? Does it have a supply chain that's in agriculture? Is it, where does it have the biggest impact on natural resources? And then we dive in a little bit more to those areas, and it's particularly to figure out if there's something they can do significantly to reduce those impacts. Some industries it's just really hard to change that, and others it's much simpler. And then we look at all aspects of that, from the ones that are quantitative, that give you a sense of where the path of travel so far has been. But then the bulk of the work is on what their plans are, their intentionality in those plans, where their product development efforts are going, and what progress they actually, what will look like progress. And so that we're tracking that and constantly tracking that. And then the other is what we call our enduring business model, which looks at a 5+ year time horizon to understand the business strategy, the financials, the operational resources required to execute on those, and the governance and management. And all that is really to help us identify, how likely is this company, independent of the environmental productivity, because they're looked at separately, but then later combined, is likely to thrive given where the world's going. So use an example. Train Technologies is in our portfolio. And that's not a big deal to say, on a podcast. And it is a company that is both benefiting effectively from the impacts of climate change, and also playing a role in enabling their customers to limit the negative effects of climate change through their technology. So it's just an inevitable thing. We know there's certainly certain things we know. It's going to get hotter and more humid on average across the planet, right? It's a pretty straightforward proposition. We also own sporting equipment companies that happen to have always made clothing that actually does really well in hotter, more humid environments, called gyms, and on athletes. And they are effectively beneficiaries of these trends. Not only that, but also towards more casual clothing and more involvement in sports. So anyway, there's a lot of different subtleties to each of these. Ultimately, what we end up with is a portfolio of companies, each of which have their own reason for being in the portfolio, because we really believe they have a very good fundamental outlook as a business, and they're also meeting our threshold for having enough of a focus on environmental productivity that we think that they're going to be more likely to be part of the solution than furthering the problem.
Yeah. It's almost the cynic in me hears some of those examples, right? And like you're betting on both sides of the equation a little bit, right? I mean, if it benefits from a world getting warmer, well, if we solve the world getting warmer, which I will admit is a big lift, right? We're talking trillions of dollars in 30 years. Like, yeah, how do you think about, what's my question? Maybe the question is, how do you think about portfolio allocation between those two silos, companies that benefit from climate change and sort of the impacts? I'll call it climate adaptation versus climate change, sort of direct addressers. What was your language again? Sorry,
Enablers.
Enablers, yeah, the enabler.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we don't want to be doing is just investing in a portfolio of beneficiaries of the worst of it. But unfortunately, as I think the science is pretty clear, that if we don't address climate change and significantly reduce the embedded impacts that we're already facing, right? It's not like, the changes are happening now.
Totally. If we went net zero tomorrow, it's still getting hotter, right?
It's still getting hotter. So that's
science.
We've already baked that in.
Yeah.
And so adaptation is a part of it, but not without significantly trying to reduce the worst potential impacts, right? So that's why environmental productivity is a necessary but not sufficient condition for us to invest. So the company has to actually understand their role. They have to be not just selling something that benefits, but they have to be making sure that product is reducing its own impact as much as possible. So if you're a sporting equipment company that means using less oil, virgin plastic, which is created with oil, in your production of your products, right? And so less polyesters and less plastic in shoes and so on. So you got to be doing that while you're still selling, you're not going to be a good investment if you're not actually selling more stuff next year than you sold this year. And
Sure.
that's kind of a necessary part. But obviously, if we don't significantly lower the future implications of climate change, that's bad for all companies. It's really bad for everyone. I mean, no one benefits. Well, I mean, very few companies benefit from that. So I think it is you're right. There's both a adaptation, mitigation, and those companies that are much more in the pioneering sector, which we would view as, a Vestas or a Tesla, where they significantly alter. They are truly changing the way we drive our economy functions and the kind of things we do in a meaningful way. There just aren't that many of those in the public equities arena. There's a lot of interesting companies. They tend to be the private equity, growth equity, venture capital, and as we've seen over the last couple of years, those that went public a little early still, haven't yet proven out the profitability side, which is why we use that screen. I mean, we got to have a path to actually being financially viable as a business to invest. So there are a few of those, and we would love to have more of those in the public sector, but there's over the last 10 years been plenty of capital in the private and venture capital world.
Yeah, that's what I think is so interesting. And I appreciate the comments you made a few questions ago around all of this data is very messy and at times subjective, right? And but at the end of the day, it is still often cheaper to ignore pricing negative externalities because of the way markets function, right? So there must be some inherent conflict. I think we're seeing with some of those public companies, right? Or the ones that were private that SPAC'd or IPO'd early and didn't hit their revenue targets or their sales targets or whatever KPIs they were priced on. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Fundamentally, it feels like if we really want to make the impact that we need, we have to start we can't arbitrarily or altruistically price those externalities. Like, they have to actually be priced, because you will never disconnect from the core fundamentals of the business. You're just adding another series, right? Maybe it's EBITDA margin or it's EBITDA multiple or whatever your normal financial metrics are. You're just adding a host of other analyses. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things we've always, since we started, one of our core impact focuses was that we needed to see all companies measure and report on their key environmental impacts. So greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 and 2, and now obviously 3. Their water use in a number of different metrics, because just how much volume of water you use is not really necessarily a great measure. You got to how much you also discharge and what the quality of that water is from discharging. So water quality is really important, but also water risk, what exposure you have to too much or too little water. And same with waste streams, because waste streams, ultimately comes back to being how much excessive raw materials you're using. And when in a society where there's limited availability of those things all become more and more expensive. So first, if you don't, it truly is an externality if you have no way of measuring how a company is actually impacting those resources. And then secondly, if you don't have some way of comparing that information across companies. So we've always been advocates for greater disclosure, greater transparency. In many cases, literally companies didn't have a rolled up analysis of this information. Obviously, they would have it at a facility level, but they didn't have that information, and they certainly didn't want to share it with anyone, because they knew then suddenly people would say, hey, wait a minute, how come you use so much more water than this company? And companies don't like that, but they respond to it. So if what you measure, you manage, right? So that is a key part of it. And now we're starting to see more regulatory change. We're seeing more pricing of these resources, whether it's water pricing as utilities can come in and privatizing of water, and they realize the only way to make sure there's enough water is by having a higher price, or whether it's insurance pricing is starting to price some of these risks. Internal carbon pricing is happening and starting to influence capital allocation of companies. And then increasingly, particularly through the EU, you're starting a lot more rules about mandatory decision making, disclosure and action around changing products and so on. They're required to do this, whether you want to do it or not. And that's creating more of a level field broadly. I mean, for all those who are operating on the same basis, and for those who are operating with a lag, obviously not leading that process, they're going to have a harder time catching up.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's well
our
said.
original thesis was if we could identify companies that are leaders, even if they're nowhere near where we need to be, they are in a better position to continue to be leaders as the cost of inaction starts to close on cost of action. And we've seen that a lot with technologies developing that really make cost of action a lot less. And the other thing that's starting to happen more is license to operate being pulled if you don't change your operations, and that's the ultimate cost. So yeah, I think there's many metrics, and I think most companies today knew this was all coming, and they were doing some of the work anyway. But now it's being thrown at them from every direction, and I'm sympathetic to leading a big multinational and trying to address not just the environmental issues, but many of the other issues they're facing. But there are companies who have been doing this more effectively for a long time, and they're a lot less stressed.
Yeah. No, that's really well said. And I haven't heard that articulated so clearly as part of other conversations. That's a real gem for this. That's quite well said. I would be curious, you talk about license to operate. Is there any commentary in your experience covering consumer goods or perhaps other commodity-like goods that become less commoditized because of consumer behavior associated with some of this reporting? I think that is actually a bigger driver, or my thesis is that is driving real change faster than regulatory change is able to keep up.
Well, I think one example I can point to that was, I wouldn't say, I guess it was a competitive comparison, but I was talking about sporting goods. One of the companies in the portfolio is Adidas. And Adidas was not necessarily a leader on sustainability, but they kind of found their way into it in an indirect way. And we've been investors in Adidas for 8 years. I think it was like 2015, they had decided to launch a niche brand product using recaptured ocean plastics. And they made 1 million pairs of the shoes. They manufactured 1 million. They sold out like in months, $200 a pair. And then the next year they say, okay, well, that worked. Let's sell some more, 5 million. Sold those out. And then 11. And they finally kind of came to an aha moment, like, wait a minute, this is really helping us grow market share.
Yeah.
Customers are giving us, this is starting to kind of create a halo. They started doing more of the material, the actual shirts, and they've committed to eliminating virgin plastic in their shoes across all 450 million pairs of shoes they make.
Wow.
So, this was an example where I don't think they necessarily thought it was going to go where they started, when they started, but it clearly differentiated their brand in a way. Now, they've had other issues that, we don't need to get into, but that was directly within their key market of sports shoes and apparel has made a big difference to that company. So yeah, I think there are examples. I would also point to when Microsoft announced their big initiative to go net zero and then eliminate all the emissions from the entire corporate history. That helped them grow market share in cloud computing.
Yeah.
very clearly. And the day they announced that, I think the stock was up 8%.
I would argue that the data center world has done more to decarbonize than like the aggregate amount of carbon taxes globally. Right?
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
they're huge power purchasers. They're driving privatized markets. Yeah, I love both of those examples in very different spheres, but it's that sort of what was once a commodity is no longer a commodity. And I think it had to happen a bit by accident. I mean, you've done the case study. Can you imagine someone pitching to an investment committee, "Hey, we're going to pay a 2x cost to make this carbon free and charge people 3x the cost?" They would laugh you out of the room, right? But
Right.
once you sell 1 million and then you sell 5 and then you sell 20, yeah, that to me is like where I am most hopeful. And then regulatory processes, I think, will just sort of catch up to the realities, right? They'll hit the stragglers,
Yeah.
which should be
Yeah.
quite interesting.
There's no doubt. I mean, I remember years ago, we were talking to a Swiss insurance company, and they were early in the process of understanding that they were not going to be able to attract a talent if they didn't have a true sustainability strategy. And they knew it because the number one place that people were going to their website was their sustainability page
Oh,
by
interesting.
far. And the bulk of the people who were on their website were employees, future prospective employees, and they were tracking that information. And it was just sort of like that's a hidden benefit, right? They were going to be able to outcompete other Swiss employers because they had a real story. And
Interesting.
that customers have been a little slower because it's more complicated. And then investors have been the slowest to pay attention, ask questions. And that's the other thing that's starting to happen is there's no doubt that as companies are getting better at communicating what they're doing in an authentic way around these issues, investors are willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on that. And they're definitely getting feedback from
Yeah.
investors.
Yeah. And you were just 8, 10 years ahead of that curve.
Yeah, that's
Um,
all right. I don't mind being ahead.
yeah, it's awesome. It must feel, I'm sure it was a slog starting out. So I'm sure it feels pretty cool to, start to see those tides turn. Maybe, yeah, with a little bit of the time we have left, tell us what your predictions are for the future. Like how does the platform evolve? How do the companies evolve? Like, what are you most excited about looking forward?
All right, I want to do one thing first. I want to mention our commitment to science-based to net zero
Oh,
and
yeah, great. Perfect.
I won't take long, but I
Oh,
mean,
please.
to us, the first and foremost, I mean, component of our environmental productivity analysis was around the biggest the elephant in the room, which was climate change, right? And water is a close second, but climate is the number one thing. And so we started out really trying to understand a company's carbon intensity and doing a lot of that data. And that data 10 years ago, 8 years ago, was really, really messy and
Yeah.
much more limited than today, which is fantastic that that's improved. So we were already looking at best in class within peer group carbon emissions for companies 8 years ago. So when the net zero initiative came along, it was sort of just effectively putting a brand or a label around what we had been doing. And we had already been pushing for countries to science-based targets. And so it gave us the opportunity to kind of put that into something that everyone, was fit in with the narrative of the day, which was a net zero goal. And so we're signatories to the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative, which means we have to do a couple of things. One, we have to set a commitment to what our targets are in that commitment. And then we have to report regularly on progress using TCFD aligned framework. And so we've committed to 100% of the assets we manage on behalf of others, which is all of our assets, to be science-based target aligned, 75% science-based target aligned by 2025 and 95% by 2030, which is significantly ahead of the 2040 goals.
Yeah.
And what that means is that of the dollars invested in the portfolio, 75% will be in companies that have validated science-based targets. And we're currently just under 70%. which is significantly ahead of where others are. And it just reflects that was how we were investing already. And the reason it's important, though, is that it allows investors to better understand how their asset manager, how seriously, intentionally takes this effort. And importantly, of course, our investors are not looking for us concessionary returns, though. They still expect us to beat the market, and we have. I think I can say that. We've had superior returns than our benchmark over the lifetime of the strategy. But we take this very seriously, and it also keeps us focused on moving our companies towards that. So when we started this commitment, we were only at 41% coverage in the portfolio. So we've been mostly moving companies in the portfolio to commit to science-based targets. Now, the big thing that needs to happen now is not just having a commitment to a science-based target and having it validated by the third party. It's actually have a plan with dollars to spend on how much it's going to cost you and what that's going to affect your returns, so that you can start implementing that. So it's an actual net zero transition plan, as opposed to just a commitment. So anyways, that's where we're focused on. So enough about science-based targets, but we think it's a really useful tool to embolden companies and prod companies to get more serious about this issue.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think there's a little bit of this world where sustainability is what the local government says it is. And so, yeah, I mean, my hope is we'll continue to get more refined as a society around how we talk about things, and exemptions and other things that like just sort of cut the initiative off at the knees sometimes.
Right.
That's like, yeah, why do this and then do that? It's some silly things.
So as to the forecast for the future, I mean, I forecast success of companies. I don't really necessarily forecast exactly what the market's going to do.
Sure.
We do believe that inevitably we will transition to a decarbonized economy, probably not quite on the ideal timeline that we'd like, but I mean, progress is being made, and that is exciting. You probably, or most people listening to this podcast probably know about Carbon Tracker Initiative and see their kind of data they put out. A lot of other organizations like yours, I'm sure, and the amount of money going into these technologies that bring down the cost curve, whether it's in EVs or whether it's in the power gen cycle area, is all pretty exciting. But we're also all nervous as heck about the timeline to generating power in place, and then getting the grid connected and getting the power to the right places. So there's a lot of unknowns, but I think the smartest minds, I think it shows that it's doable. And I'm an optimist. I mean, if you're focused on the environment and long-term only public investing, you better be an optimist, or you're in the wrong job. So yeah. I do think there's a path to still getting under 2 degrees. Obviously, we're not going to stay under 1.5, but so that's why we do have to adapt and mitigate. And we mitigate and adapt. But there are plenty of places there. We will have lots of migration. We'll have lots of change, but I think we can still get to a place where we can sustainably live on this planet.
Yeah, amazing. Well, what a great optimistic note. Really appreciate your time, and super excited for others to hear all the intelligent things you have to say.
Thank you, Michael. It was a real joy.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.